Alright, so picture this, okay? It's just after midnight, it's June 6, 1944, and you're not about to storm a beach or take a bridge. No, you're standing in the open door of a C-47, the engines are screaming, and the cold, wet air of France is slapping you in the face. But you're not going to jump into some epic battle, you're not going to have thousands of your buddies, you're just going to jump completely alone. So your job, once you swam into the ground in the pitch-black Nazi-infested countryside, is to find one specific field, a field you've only seen on a map, and light it up like a Christmas tree. So they gave you a couple weird looking lamps, a radio that weighs a ton, and they even give you a rifle. And your whole mission is to turn some random French pasture into a glowing, unmissable target. Why? Because in about an hour, 13,000 of your friends are right behind you, their lives in a massive piece of the whole D-Day pyre, riding on you turning the lights in the middle of the world's most dangerous blackout. So officially, it wasn't a suicide mission, but if you read the job description, you'd probably start updating your will. So this was arguably the most pants-shittingly critical job on D-Day. This is the story of the Pathfinders, who were the guys who were the first boots on the ground, and they were the tiny sparks sent in to guide an avalanche. So, to understand why the Army would ask a couple hundred guys to do something this insane, you have to rewind about a year back before D-Day to another invasion on another island, Sicily. So in July 1943, Operation Husky was meant to be the first big test for the American airborne troops in Europe. So the paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne were supposed to drop behind enemy lines, raise some hell, and then secure the roads before the main force hit the beaches. So on paper, it was a great plan, but in reality, it was an absolute shit show. The problems started immediately. High winds were smacking the transport planes around, tossing them way off course. You had green navigators getting lost over the water, pilots are flying through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire from their own nervous fleet. Instead of a tight, concentrated drop, the 82nd Airborne was sprinkled across hundreds of square miles like salt. You had guys landing alone, miles from anywhere and anybody they even knew. Some dropped right into the ocean and were dragged to the bottom by their heavy gear. Then that's when the real disaster hits. So you had the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment flying in as reinforcements. Unfortunately, nobody told the Navy gunners about it. So, thinking the C-47s were German bombers, they opened fire. In a horrifying friendly fire incident, you had 23 American planes who just got blasted out of the sky. So you had guys who flew all the way from North Africa, and unfortunately, they were just killed by their own side. So in the end, Operation Husky ended up being a success, but just barely. You had the scattered paratroopers fighting like cornered badgers in small groups. Luckily, they were completely disrupting the German and the Italian response. Unfortunately, the lesson was written in blood. General Eisenhower himself wondered if big airborne drops were even a good idea. And after that, it was obvious that just dumping thousands of guys out of planes and hoping for the best was just a recipe for disaster. So they determined they needed a better way. So the bloody fiasco actually became the birthplace of the American Pathfinders. The idea wasn't brand new, the Brits actually had already messed around with it, but after Sicily, the Americans got serious. So you had Major General Matthew Ridgway from the 82nd, who was their commander, and he basically said, "This is never going to happen to my men again." So he actually demanded a fix to this. And the fix was actually a new flavor of soldier. They had to be volunteers because you can't make somebody do this, and they plucked them from the already elite 82nd and the 101st Airborne. So their job was to go in first 30 minutes to an hour ahead of everybody else. They were going to face the dark, the confusion, and the enemy totally alone. So they were going to carry all the heavy, high-tech gear needed to mark the drop zones. These were the Pathfinders. It was a stupid job that required a lot of stupid amounts of bravery, skill, and a hell of a lot of grit. But it was the direct answer to the chaos that came out of Sicily. But as they were about to find out, no plan survives contact with the enemy. So who were the guys who signed up for a mission with a distressingly high chance of just not coming back? They actually were a special breed, and all of them were experienced paratroopers, absolute wizards with a map. I mean, Harry Potter probably would have been envious with this skills. And they were just experts at sneaking around. So they were trained to operate in total blackness, to be completely self-reliant, and they had to kill people very, very efficiently. So at a special school at RAF North Witham in England, these hand-picked soldiers were turned into a brand new weapon for America. The training was a non-stop suckfest, so they jumped constantly day and night, learning how to hit a tiny spot on the ground with nothing but a map. They got really intimate with all of Normandy's bocage country. It had hedgerows and a confusing maze of fields and sunken roads. They drilled until they could do it all in their sleep. And the gear they carried was straight-up science fiction for 1944. So the core of their mission was a two-part system called the Eureka-Rebecca. Each Pathfinder team jumped with a portable transponder beacon, the AN/PPN-1, or better known as the Eureka. This 35-pound box was their lifeline, so once they got it running on the drop zone, it sent out a radio pulse. And then flying at the front of every C-47 formation was a lead plane that had the other half, which was the AM/APN-2, or better known as the Replica receiver. So the Replica's antennas were sticking out of the plane's nose like whiskers, so it would pick up the Eureka signal, and then it would point the pilots right into the drop zone. It actually allowed them for a level of precision that was basically impossible, especially when it's pitch black and it's nighttime. But technology's fragile, so the planners knew they just couldn't rely on some fancy radios, so the Pathfinders actually ended up carrying out visual aids with them. The most important were actually the holophane lights. So you had light men, as they were called back then, in each team, and they consisted of several of those lamps, which had colored lenses. So they had green, red, or amber, and they were to mark specific drop zones. They'd lay them out on the ground in a big T shape with the base pointing towards the approaching planes, and at the base of the T, another guy was flashing a Morse code letter for that actual drop zone. For daytime, they had big colored tarps and smoke grenades, so they had green for just come on in, and then they had red for it's a death trap. So a typical Pathfinder stick was the group jumping from one plane was a small army of specialists. So for the 101st, it was about 18 dudes. You had a lieutenant who was in charge, about a dozen guys who were the tech support, Eureka operators and lightmen, and the other 6 had one simple job, which was security. So they were the trigger pullers, so they had M1 carbines usually and submachine guns, and they were tasked with protecting the nerds while they set up shop. So every single man was loaded down, and on top of their weapon ammo and the food, they carried the bulky heavy tools of their trade. They were jumping into combat as both tech specialists and infantrymen, and they had to be perfect at both. So as they got on their planes on June 5th, 1944, they were the absolute tip of the Allied spear, and they were about to be thrown against the wall of fog, flak, and Germans. Okay, so it's the evening of June 5th on 1944, and all across the airfields in England, the vibe's weird. You got Red Cross girls handing out coffee, photographers are taking pictures, and the officers are out there shaking hands. So for the cameras, you had the young Pathfinders who were all jokes and smiles, but underneath it all, the tension was so thick you could just cut it with a knife. At 9:50 p.m. at North Whittam, the engines of a C-47 Skytrain fired up, and the pilot for them was Lieutenant Colonel Joel Crouch, and the guy's an absolute certified badass. So in the back, you got 18 guys from the 101st Pathfinder Company, and their leader is actually Captain Frank Lillyman, who's a 28-year-old from New York. As the plane screams down the runway, Lillyman's sitting there with a smirk on his face, and he's chewing on an unlit cigar, which apparently is his good luck charm for every jump he's done. And then the plane lifts off. So they're the first, and behind them you had 19 more C-47s with over 200 American Pathfinders are climbing into the night, and they're headed for Normandy's Cotentin Peninsula. So the radio silence is absolute. You got the planes flying in a tight V low over the English Channel, but their biggest enemy tonight actually isn't the Germans, it ends up being the weather. The forecast said clear skies, but as they near the French coast, they fly straight into a huge thick bank of clouds, and it's a pilot's worst nightmare. So the type formations, which were critical, instantly fall apart. Pilots can't see their own wingtips, let alone the other planes next to them, and every plane's now on its own. So just after midnight, they cross the coast, and that's when all hell breaks loose. The sky just explodes with German anti-aircraft fire. You got tracers reaching up for the planes. You have explosions rocking the C-47s, filling the cabin with the smell of cordite as shrapnel's just ripping through the thin aluminum skin. You got the pilots blinding the clouds or getting shot at, start taking wild evasive maneuvers, and then in the back, you got the paratroopers getting thrown around like rag dolls. So the plan is actually for a nice low, slow drop right out of the window. Now it's a high-speed run through a gauntlet of fire. So you have a lot of pilots who are panicking, they're getting lost, flying way too fast or too high. Inside of Captain Lillyman's plane, you got the red light flashing, and he's yelling at his guys to go. So out he goes into the wind, his 17 men right behind him. And then you have Lieutenant Colonel Crouch, who decides to bank the plane hard, and he dives straight for the channel. And his clock says 12:15 a.m. or 0:15 on June 6th. So Captain Frank Lillyman after this is officially the first American paratrooper to set foot on the ground on D-Day. Problem though now is, where the hell is he? So he's supposed to be at Drop Zone Alpha, unfortunately he's not. So he ended up landing at a field about a mile away. And all over the peninsula, it's the same story. You've got Pathfinders for the 82nd and the 101st, aiming for 6 different drop zones. So you had Alpha, Charlie, and Delta for the 101st, and Oscar, November, and Tango for the 82nd. And unfortunately, they're all scattered around like dandelion seeds in a hurricane. So some guys are getting dropped miles from their DZ, others land right on top of German positions, and unfortunately they're killed before they can even get out of their parachute harness. Many in the 82nd sector landed in fields the Germans flooded on purpose, and unfortunately being weighed down by hundreds of pounds of gear, they drown in the dark water. So the meticulously planned operation just begins to disintegrate, and unfortunately the tip of the spear shatters. So for the first 100 Pathfinders on the ground, scattered alone and hunted, the worst job on D-Day has just begun. Alright, so the jump was violent. The landing was essentially gravity winning the argument and hard. For Captain Frank Lillyman, it was a rough touchdown in a field surrounded by the giant dark shapes of Normandy hedgerows, and dropping from only 450 feet, he just had seconds to steer his chute towards a clearing and he got lucky. All over the peninsula, the Pathfinders were in a fight for their lives from the second they landed. The scattering was way worse than anyone even imagined. Of the 200 plus American Pathfinders who jumped, less than a third landed anywhere close to their assigned drop zones. So for these guys, the mission wasn't just setting up the gear, it was just trying not to die. So picture it, okay? You got one guy stuck in a tree just hanging there helpless, another lands with a sickening crunch in a courtyard, his legs shattered, and a ton of them come down in the flooded marshes along the Merdere and Doubs rivers. Their gear's pulling them under before they can even take a breath. So for them, unfortunately, the war was over in a matter of minutes. Their own equipment was actually their own death trap for a lot of these guys. Their leg bags are holding the vital radios and the lights, get ripped off during the violent jump, or they just get lost in the dark. So you got whole teams landing together, but they couldn't find their Eureka beacon. Radio operators are landing fine, but they don't have a radio. And then you had guys with lights, but they didn't even have batteries. So for them, those first few minutes on the ground were a mad scramble. Unclip the harness, find your gun, and figure out where the hell you are. So every noise is actually a threat. 101st was the ones who used those little metal cricket toys where one click-clack was to challenge, and 2 of those was actually the reply. You had the 82nd who used the passwords Thunder and Flash, but using them was a risk because obviously doing that could get you killed. So in that moment, Lillyman, realizing he was a mile off, he knew he didn't have time to even get to DZ Alpha, so he improvises. So he basically finds a big open field and just says, here's the new drop zone. So it was a choice made out of pure necessity, and other Pathfinder leaders were actually doing the same thing. You had the 502nd Pathfinder team, who landed about 1.25 miles off, but they adopted the same thing and find a new spot for their gear. The Germans weren't just sitting around though. Over in Umfreyville, the Pathfinder team for the 82nd over in Drop Zone Tango had the worst luck imaginable. They actually landed perfectly, but right on top of a bunch of German troops. So unfortunately, they die the second they hit the ground, and they get met with a hail of machine gun fire as soon as they touch down. So they didn't even have time to set anything up, unfortunately, and the Pathfinders became infantrymen right from the beginning. They fought, they scattered, they tried to survive. The after-action report for them is brutally short, and it says, due to aggressive action of enemy troops, the drop zone was not set up according to SOP and no lights were turned on. And even for Lillyman's group, the enemy's actually really close. So as they're setting up, they heard a German MG-42 open from a nearby hedgerow. And actually, in Lillyman's own words, he actually says the sounds were damn it annoying. So he sends 2 of his security guys to take care of it. And then a few minutes later, there's a grenade that goes off. Then, as Lillyman remembers, everything was lovely and quiet. So this was their reality, okay? They were technicians, they were navigators, they were commandos all at once and in a desperate race against the clock. All right, so those of you out there who are big history buffs, I'm just gonna take a quick second out to show you guys something really cool, things to come into future ones. So, for those of you who are a fan of history, I was lucky enough to get these from a museum, and I was able to get a whole bunch of other things that I'm gonna be showing at the end of each section. So once we finish up a series, I'll get to show some really cool ones. These ones I'm just gonna show a little bit early, but I'll put some links down below if you guys want to read the books. So I got a copy actually of Hang Tough, which is the World War II letters and artifacts from Dick Winters, and the forewords by Bradford Freeman, which we'll come back to him in a minute. But, so these are the books, which are really neat. I will have them linked down below if you guys want to get a copy of your own to read. These were special ones, so there's actually a piece that's an authentic parachute that came out of that. So it was actually really neat. And for those of you who don't know, we'll touch back on Bradford Freeman here while I get the other book. The interesting thing about Bradford Freeman was, unfortunately, he recently passed, but he was actually the last surviving member of Easy Company. So when I saw that, I actually reached out to a local museum and I had to snag that as quick as I could. This was the story of Spears, Ronald Spears, who most of you already know, if you've seen Band of Brothers, obviously. This one's his book, and it's another one that's autographed by Bradford Freeman again. And the interesting thing about this one, though, why I saved this one a little bit more last, is if you look closely here, this one has his signature, but the interesting thing about this is, this one actually has a piece of Bill Garnier's parachute from D-Day. So I thought that was really neat. I just wanted to kind of share this with you guys. There's a lot more to come in the future, so I hope you guys are excited. Be sure to check in at the end of the series. So I hope you guys are excited. At the end of each series, I'm going to show something where we get the different ones, but I have pieces from the Germans, the Japanese, the Americans, and I actually have other things here like that from Easy Company. So I hope you guys are really excited. And like I said, if you guys are interested in history, DVDs, whatever type you like, if you like to read, if you like movies, audiobooks, things like that, some of the things that I think are kind of interesting, I'll be sure to put those links down below there for you guys in the description. And with all of that said, let's get right back to the video. All right, so the clock was ticking, all right? The main assault force was going to be there in 30 to 45 minutes, and there was absolutely no room for error. So for the few Pathfinder teams who found a usable field, the frantic work starts. So over with Lilyman, his improvised drop zone, he has 18 men working like madmen in the dark. You got the Eureka operators with their beacons out, they hook up the battery and they flip it on. A low hum means it's sending its signal. So the radio goes into the void, and hopefully the Rebecca was listening. So meanwhile, you got the lightmen scrambling across the field, laying out the green lens lamps in the T formation. But it wasn't a training exercise, so obviously every shadow can be an enemy. 6-man security teams start out into the darkness, and they got their fingers on the triggers and they're ready for a fight. So those 45 minutes later, and Lowyman actually says later on, it was the longest of his life. To the men on the ground, the lights seemed insanely bright, and he says those lights never looked bright in training, but that night they looked like searchlights. So it felt like they painted a giant shoot here sign on their own position. And actually a German bicycle patrol actually spots them, but he sees a bunch of determined looking Americans, so he actually decides to pedal away really, really fast. So the story is different in other places. For the 82nd Airborne Pathfinders over at Drop Zone Oscar near St. Mary Glees, things actually went great. The team lands within 400 yards of their target with almost no trouble, and they have their Eureka lights working in just 10 minutes. So theirs was the only drop zone for the 82nd to be fully and correctly marked. For others, it's a mixed bag. You have the team for Drop Zone November scattered and they're taking heavy fire, but through the grit of one guy, he actually gets his Eureka beacon working even without his lights. So that partial success actually is still a win because it guided some planes close to where they needed to be. And that's when they came. The distant drone of 100 engines is growing into a deafening roar. So the sky's filling with C-47s, the Eureka beacons work, pilots see the glowing T's and they yell green light and tell everybody to go. But unfortunately, the chaos of the flight takes its toll. So the main formations are also scattered. You got some pilots are spooked by the flak. They drop their troops too early or too late. The 505th drop near the well-lit DZ Oscar was pretty accurate, but other units weren't so lucky. Still, it wasn't Sicily all over again. The Pathfinder's work, as messed up as it was, actually makes a huge difference. You got the drops are scattered, but they're way more concentrated around the beacons than they would have been. Only one of the 101st drop zones and one of the 82nds were properly marked, but those couple of glowing fields were actually enough to stop a total disaster. And ironically, the scattering of the paratroopers had an upside. The Germans actually are completely baffled. They start having reports flooding into their headquarters about paratroopers landing everywhere at once, and it looks like the whole sky's fallen, and it ends up completely paralyzing the German response. So the chaos the Pathfinders had suffered through had been turned around on the enemy. So their desperate, often failed mission had succeeded just enough to give the airborne invasion a fighting chance. So for the Pathfinders, the arrival of the main force wasn't the end of the mission, unfortunately. It was just the end of Phase 1 for them. So there's no ride back to England for a hot breakfast. The second the last paratrooper hits the ground, the Pathfinder's subscription to being a technician expires and they become infantrymen. But they're highly skilled, heavily armed, and already in the middle of the fight. All over Normandy, these little teams became the core that scattered paratroopers of the main force rally around. They were the first friendly faces and the first piece of order in the chaos. Unfortunately for Captain Frank Lilyman and his men, they didn't even get time to celebrate, so he leads his team on a 7-mile cross-country murder hike to prep a landing zone for the gliders coming in later. And as they moved, they actively hunted Germans. Lilyman noted that the enemy were experts at hiding in hedgerows, so he had his men stay off the road. And by the end of it, they ended up eliminating 18 enemy soldiers and they didn't even lose a single man. Later on D-Day, while securing another glider landing zone, however, Lilyman's luck runs out. So as the gliders came in, the Germans open up with everything they had, and Lilyman's running to help guys in a crashed glider when unfortunately a bullet smashes into his arm. As he went down, a mortar splinter tore right into his face. So he gets wounded, they ship him back to England, and unfortunately the stubborn captain wasn't having it. So he talks his way back to a transport plane, and he gets back with his men just 8 days later. This switch from specialist to grunt happens everywhere. So near Carentan, the Pathfinder teams fight a vicious close-range battle with veteran German paratroopers in the tangled hedgerows. So there's a story actually that comes out later that supposedly when Major General Maxwell Taylor, the commander of the 101st, finally meets Lilyman, he actually was so pissed that the famous Pathfinder had been fighting like a regular rifleman. According to one account, Taylor actually waves Lilyman's promotion papers in his face, and then he tears him up. The cost is insane though. The 82nd Airborne's after-action reports noted the 508's Pathfinder team lost roughly 2/3 of its men, while the 507's team was missing 20. So there's catastrophic losses for such small elite units. They went in first, and they definitely paid for it. Their legacy, however, gets set in stone, so Pathfinders end up leading the way in every major Allied airborne drop for the rest of the war in southern France, in Holland during Operation Market Garden, and even across the Rhine into Germany. Their biggest encore was during the Battle of the Bulge, so when the 101st Airborne surrounded in Bastogne, a team of Pathfinders, including some Normandy vets, jumped into the siege. Once again, they set up their Eureka beacons to guide the C-47s to get that critical supply drop to the troops. And this actually allows the battered bastards of Bastogne to hold out. It's the same job under impossible conditions, jumping into a ring of fire just to light the way. So the story of the Pathfinders is just one of thousands of tales of insane bravery from World War II, and a lot of them are forgotten. So if you believe these stories need to be told, that the sacrifice of these men deserves to be remembered, you know the drill. Be sure to obliterate that like button and subscribe to the channel. So, was being a Pathfinder the worst job on D-Day? Let's review the tape. You jump in first into total darkness with the highest possible chance of getting lost, captured, or killed before the party even starts. You're weighed down with fragile gear that absolutely has to work. Your main job is to make yourself a giant target, and if you pull it off, your reward isn't even a trip home, but you get a front row seat to the worst fighting of the invasion, which you're now expected to join. By any sane measurement, it was a terrifying, thankless, and monumentally dangerous job. But the Pathfinders of the 82nd and the 101st did more than just light up a few fields. These guys were the pioneers, so they were the first guys to kick down the door to Fortress Europe, and the beacons they managed to set up despite the chaos, the flak, and the Germans saved the entire American airborne assault from being a complete train wreck. The firefights they started on the ground just added to the panic that paralyzed the German command in those first critical hours. They were a tiny group of men, less than 300 total, tasked with guiding in an entire army. And unfortunately, a lot of them didn't see the sun come up on June 6th, but their courage, their skill, and their willingness to do the impossible lit the fuse for the entire liberation of Europe. They were the first in, and their legacy is burned into the history of that longest day. Thank you everybody for watching, and if you want more stories like this one, the ones buried in the chaos, and the ones that don't always get the spotlight, be sure to stick around. There's a lot more history out there worth dragging into the light coming to the channel soon. So be sure to tune in every 18th for new content. Next month, we're going to have the new gaming video coming with a few new friends you haven't gotten to meet yet for some hysterical, epic, and amazing hella loose gameplay. It's going to have Generation, who you all know, my friend Soju Boy, and Graves, who I'm super excited for you all to meet. This documentary is the first part of a series I'll be working on, and at the end of each series, as we work our way towards Berlin, I'm going to have a lot of cool collectibles I was lucky enough to get from a local museum that I'm going to show at the end of each series. I've got pieces from the Americans, the Germans, the Japanese, and we've even got pieces of history from the infamous Easy Company from Band of Brothers. I made sure these are all certified authentic, so these are all super rare pieces of history that are one of a kind, that I'm extremely grateful to them not only to own them, but to show these at the end of each series. So be sure to keep coming back so you don't miss these amazing drops coming in the future. Thank you guys all so much for watching, and be sure to let me know your favorite part of this in the comments, or if you have any other topics you'd like me to do in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments as well. And with all that said, I will see you all in the next one. Later, guys.